Hello, this is Marisol Solarte-Erlacher, psychotherapist and consultant, and this is the Resilience and Resistance Podcast, a podcast about successful Black, Indigenous women of color who have overcome trauma and become resilient. Hi, Athena.
Hi, Marisol.
Thank you so much for being a guest on this podcast. I so appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm excited. Really honored. Yeah.
So I would love for you to introduce yourself. Just tell us how you identify, what you do in the world, and anything important you want our audience to know.
Sure. So I'm Athena Baca-Chieza. Professionally, I'm Dr. Athena Baca-Chieza. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. And by training, my specialization is as a medical psychologist. And I can talk a little bit about what that means. How I identify personally is interesting. It's actually changed and evolved quite a bit as I've kind of aged, and there's a story there, but I was born and raised in El Paso, Texas, and so I'm a border town girl. That's a very big part of my identity, and raised in a Mexican town, Mexican-American town on the U.S.-Mexican border by a first-generation Mexican family. And that's just very much an important piece and part of my story. Yeah. Let's see, I'm a mom to two beautiful daughters and a wife to an incredible, amazing husband who's an African immigrant from Zimbabwe. And yeah, I've been a psychologist. I moved to Denver in 2005, which is right about the time I met you, actually. Very, very shortly after that, I met you. Yeah, so we've known each other for a really long time. And I have been in the area since then. And now, although I've been a medical psychologist my entire career, I've always had a part in training. So I do clinical supervision, and a large part of my career, although there's been clinical involvement, training has always been an important piece to that. And so now, as you know, the longer one is in a career, you tend to, depending on who you know, my career has evolved and become largely leadership. And now I'm strangely in academia, which I never thought I would be. But so I run a clinical training program at the University of Colorado, Denver, at Anschutz, and see bone marrow transplant patients and oncology patients, which is where I started and where my training is. And so I get to do some work there still with patients, and all of my training and supervision of students tends to still be around how one develops their skills in medical psychology. So working with people who have chronic illness, really the challenges around chronic illness, terminal illness, grief around that experience, caregivers and caregiver grief around terminal illness, chronic illness, and the impact that has. And so my experiences, when you were asking about trauma and resilience, they tend to professionally stem around illness and the impact that can have. And I know that, and not to get too personal, but I know that, all of us, and in particular now, it's very, very much a prevalent topic in our lives, what chronic illness means, and illness, it's impacted us all, whether we've wanted it to or not. Right. But it can really have profound impact on our families when illness, touches our personal lives. And so I know that is close to you, it's close to me, and I've seen what resilience means in a lot of different ways, professionally and personally. And so, I think that's sort of how I identify. I think from a personal level, the way that's evolved and changed quite a bit is that I was adopted as a newborn into my family. And so that, didn't have, although it's always been a part of my story, and my parents talked about this a lot with me from the moment, they were, I was born in the 70s and they attended all the classes, but that was a very progressive, I talk to my parents now, I'm like, that was so progressive of you as Mexicans, to have adopted a child, but they were just so desperate to have children. And, so they took the classes and they did what they were supposed to do. And so they talked to me developmentally as they, could, to introduce the concept of adoption. But what was not discussed at the time, as I look at people now who have adopted children, was that I think I know now that I was a tran-racial adoptee. And I always looked very different from my family. My what I consider my family of origin. And so that has played a huge role and impact on my life, because my parents subsequently had 3 biological children. I'm only 15 months older than my sister, and then 4 years later came another sister, and then my brother. And so I'm the oldest of 4 children with only a 7-year spread. So we're a very large, 6 of us, largish family and close. And I look very different. My husband teases all the time. He's like, you look like the foreign exchange student in all your family members. And we joke and we use humor. But I always had this sense of, both from knowing I was adopted, although my family loved, adored, and did their very best, as most adoptive families do, to try to make sure that I knew I was loved and adored and was theirs. Adoption is complex, as I'm guessing as a therapist. I don't know if you've ever had and worked with adoptees, but there's always just going to be that primal.
Yes.
So there was always that, but then also just literally not looking like my family. My sister within groups of color, there's so much range of how, like Black, Latino, even within those groups, there's so much range of how you look and how your skin color and everything. So even with my Latino family, my sister that's right after me is white presenting, like weta, like fair skin, freckles. My brother's dark skin, green eyes. My grandpa, born in Chihuahua, white skin, blue eyes. So run the gamut in my Mexican family. My grandmother was indigena, like dark skin. So even within my family, who is biologically related, there's a wide range. But when my sister, who's white passing, introduces me as, this is my sister, because that is who we are to each other. They're like, your sorority sister? And we're like, no. And because we forget that we don't look alike. And then we're like, oh, no, my sister, and so that has always been, I was thinking about resilience and trauma and all of these things, like those are like have always been little dings to me. This idea of not belonging, not fitting in, and then zooming out from my nuclear family, being from a border town. And this idea of Mexican, but not Mexican enough, because we're on the border and there are real clear politics. Yes. And I was listening to one of your podcasts earlier, and your family's from a border town. Your mom's from a border town. Yes. And I can tell that you know about this. Yeah. Border town. I love being from a border town, but nothing jacks with your head more than when you don't belong to a group and you are reminded constantly. So you're not Mexican because you're not truly a native Mexican, but you're Mexican American, but you're like, El Paso's weird too, because we're barely in Texas. So I'm always like, I realize that there's been this part of my identity where I'm always just like not really fitting in. And then through technology and 23andMe, I eventually came to find that what I'd always, my whole life, are you mixed? Are you Black? What are you? All the time. What are you? I finally was able to name that I am mixed. I'm straight, a third European, a third Native. So Mexicans, I don't know if you have ever.
Yeah, of course.
So it comes out as Native American and European. So that's the Mexican side of me. We knew my birth mother was Mexican, and then a third Black. So it was able to be confirmed. So there was that. So I've been able to speak to an identity that I always felt and that the world saw and the world would name. And that was a really hard thing, to have others name things that my own family wouldn't name. And that has been a really, really hard challenge, because Mexicans, I'll speak for my family when I say Mexicans. My Mexican family is just, there's a lot of racism there. They grew up in a time and in a place where there was just profound and immense classism, racism, sexism. If there is an ism, it's in my family and in my culture and just area of origin. And my family is working very hard and has been for a long time, but it's there. And they, I think, did not want to see that in their daughter. And certainly did not want to celebrate that. I am so envious of friends of mine who are transracial adoptive families. And I watch them just like take in their children and celebrate as much as they can what they learn about their children's cultures and ethnicities of origin. And I'm just like mind blown by this. And but I keep going back to these like, sort of like big T trauma and little T trauma. And to me, these are like little chips at my identity and sense of belonging. And I think that all of these things kind of contributed, though, also to my ability to build a sense of resilience, because I had to figure out also how to pass and how to belong.
Yeah. Wow, Athena, there's so much.
There's so much. But it keeps going back to identity.
Absolutely. And I think that, just thinking about, I think that idea of growing up in a border town, and I think I've spoken to this in previous podcast episodes, is, what I started to understand in my transition. I grew up in Illinois. When I came to Colorado and started to really understand Chicanismo, Chicano identity, what that meant, it helped me understand my mom's experience more. Because growing up, she never identified as Chicana. I know. I think she holds that identity now. I think that she would say that that's true. But, I think that it's so complex. And I think about her stories and kind of how she worked through her own identity, which has been very interesting and really informed how, the evolution of my own identity. But I'm curious, because I think that this is something that's so important to me, in terms of the work that I do and the things that I think about is, and I think you're speaking to, how anti-Blackness shows up in Latinx communities, that it's a thing, right? That we talk about, but don't talk about. I think that there's those of us who, maybe have a little bit more separation, or maybe there's, a generational piece to this that we're able to have conversations, but we don't really dig into it.
No.
And the impact of it. And I think that you're speaking to that in terms of, your family's inability, whatever it was for them to be able to actually have a conversation about it and help you understand your own identity based on what their own struggles were in terms of, how that permeated, your family. And then, how just the overall impact of that is you're trying to unravel and understand your own your newfound identity and how you settle into that.
Absolutely. I think it's so hard. There was an incredible article, I'll have to send it to you, in Texas Monthly last year after George Floyd was murdered. And it was calling out Latin Americans in particular in our racism against Black people. And how deeply ingrained this is in our culture, in media, in our family culture, in our language, in our soap operas, and I was reading this article and I was just like, oh my God, this is so insane. This is unreal and true. And I knew it cognitively, but I was reading it from a personal perspective, and, George Floyd, I think, ravaged us all in many ways and for different reasons. And, but it really had a deep impact on my family. And, this article was naming a lot of reasons why for me. But it was talking about just like even our, the way that what are those words when we, like the niceties and like the little nicknames that we have for each other. So my nickname growing up in my family was Prieta, mi negra. And it was always like in love, because then you're güera. If you're blonde, you're, hey, güera, come here. If you're chubby, hey, gorda, come here. Yeah, sometimes they're like words that you're like, you're calling that kid fat. Well, it's like, no, like, yeah, in English it's fat and it sounds terrible, but in Spanish it's cute, you know? Right, exactly. So in Spanish it was like, ¿Dónde está la negra? Whereas in English it's like, where's the black girl? And it never ever, or la prieta, dark skin girl. It never was I never felt offended by it. And in fact, I always felt like that was like my special name because there was no one else. But in the context, like when you take a step back and you start to like really think about the history of Black people in essence, the Americas, it was like, and thinking about how language has power, we were really isolating. And in particular, like in my family and in the Southwest, there's a lot of history there and there's a lot of implications there and what it meant to be a güera versus a negra. Right. And so all of these things really had impact, I think, on me and my self-esteem, and starting to think about all the other people who had these nicknames, and zooming out for me personally, thinking about what this article was talking about. What role have we all had, myself included, because trust me, I am absolutely not innocent of this, and have had to really come into my own in being proud of a dual identity, because I was always the proudest Mexican in the room. I'm the only one who's fluent in Spanish in my whole family, because I needed to be something. I was like, I don't look like anything. No one can tell what I am. They want me to be something that I definitely don't identify as, which was Black. And I didn't even know, any Black people. Right. So I was like, I need to be something. So it was like, we as, I now identify as Afro-Latina, but in general, we as Latin Americans and Spanish-speaking Latin Americans, or at least, I think Latin American have to really look at what have we done and what is our role in racism, also within our own groups, classism, colorism, nationalism. There is and again with the border town politics, all of those things. You're not enough of anything. If your skin is just dark enough, then you're here. If it's too light, then you're here. So absolutely. I think that there's a lot there. And I've had to myself within my family really start to look at deeply and call things out and name things and have uncomfortable conversations and model that for my daughters who are, they're Black. They identify as Black. They themselves in our home are proud to be Afro-Latinas because that's what we talk about, but they know the minute they leave our front door, they are Black. Right. And that is something that they're extremely proud of. And they're lucky to be growing up in a day and time where I think there's a lot more pride to be held and language to be held. But we're also in a bubble, and we tell them that they're in a bubble, that not a lot of the world is going to treat them the same way all the time. Yeah. So equipping them to, regardless of what the world throws at them, that they have to find ways to hold value, hold pride, hold self-worth, have resilience, regardless of what messages they hear, what language is used to describe them, etc. And they're just lessons that you and I and our parents' generation beyond had to figure out in much harder ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm curious, Athena, now that moving into this identity of Afro-Latina, and really owning that and really trying to help your family integrate that identity and respect it and own it. How has that, just in terms of, I think it seems as though making that shift has also helped you understand and contextualize your own experience in terms of, however you identify them, big T, small t traumas, the racism that you experienced, but probably weren't able to process it as racism. What has that process been like for you in terms of just trying to understand the impact?
It's ever evolving. It's definitely still very much, I would say, at the early stages. I think that my family, from the perspective of my family, I think they still don't see me. They just don't see that. They don't see me. I was president recently of the Colorado Psychological Association. And I wrote it was one of my letters from the president. It was my first letter from the president. And I had to write one of these letters every month. And so it was the first month. And so I was introducing myself. And so in this introduction, I said, I'm a proud Afro-Latina from El Paso, Texas. And my mom was reading this and she was just like, why do you have to say that?
Yeah.
And it's just like, that is like so hard, I was like, if I can get through this podcast without crying, it will be a miracle. But it's hard, and I also have to I'm at a point where I'm like, I can't own everyone's journey. I'm like, I've tried so hard to like carry other people's stuff. And it's too much, and my husband is so amazing because he's the one that's really taught me. And this is the cultural part. Like, I have identified so strongly as Mexican, and it's something I'm so proud of and I love so deeply. And it's all I know, really. And no one's really taught me how to be Black at all. Right. And I don't even know what that means, because Black is so rich and deep and layered. Black what? Southern Black, Northern Black? Are your roots in New Orleans? Are your roots in that I can't even begin to describe how diverse Black culture is in America. So I don't even know what that means exactly, but it means a lot. That's what I do know. But no one has taught me what that is. I just know that the world sees that. So that's hard. But my husband has been really amazing because for me, family is everything, right? Like what some of the deep Hispanic, Latino cultural norms that I've deeply internalized, that contribute to my trauma and why this has been so traumatic for me is that even when things are hurtful, even when my family's doing hurtful things, I'm still deeply enmeshed with my family of origin. They still mean everything to me. They still, their impact on me is still profound. What they think of me is still profound. I still look to them for everything. So even as a 44-year-old woman, I'm still like crying at something that my mom said. That's her stuff, but it's still my mom. Exactly. It's your mom's still always going to be your mom, your dad's and so part of my work and part of my trying to build resilience around my identity development is that's still going to hurt, and it's okay for that to really hurt you, but you don't have to take on what's other people's stuff. And my husband's really been deeply helpful. And honey, our families, we got our own stuff in our own house with our own kids and our own marriage. We can't take on, because his family, I love him to death and he loves him to death. But sometimes we got to close the door to all our family stuff. And that has been so liberating for me. And he's not even a therapist, but that has been
exactly.
But that's been one of the most liberating lessons is Because in our culture, you do take everything on, and it is ours. Good, bad, and ugly. And it's part of what I love, but it's also part of what's been unhealthy, I think, is that we take on our family's trauma, we take on their drama, we take on too much. And so there are no boundaries. And so sometimes we just carry like the weight of the world. And it's like, no, I'm trying to learn from that and teach my daughters, like, what are the beautiful things about family and culture and all the things, but also what are things that really are unhealthy. Like, you don't, mommy may be sad today, but that's mommy's. You don't have to go to bed feeling the burden of whatever because mommy feeling sad. Whereas when I was growing up, if mommy was crying and sad because mommy's the martyr, we all got to feel sad, or whatever.
Absolutely.
Because that's just, that's just so deeply ingrained that's what we do, And so, I don't know, it's just, so to get back to your question, I'm still trying to figure all that out because I don't have a lot of support. I don't think that they see me. My youngest sister has really been calling my family out hard. Like, do you understand that your daughter, like why she's devastated by the murder of George Floyd is that was her? That is not, and her husband and your grandchildren, like, do you get and I'm like, Ronnie, and my sister, I'm like, I can't. And she's like, Tina, they call me Tina, you she's trying to take on this fight for me. And I so love and appreciate it. But it's also like, it's a lot. And it's something that I think, and I've, again, zooming out for me and trying to contextualize this and make this bigger for your audience. And I know that what I am going through is something that so many people are going through, which is this conflict of identity and crisis of identity, in that, what does all of this mean for me? Who am I really? And what happens when the identity that I grew up with is all of a sudden in conflict with the identity that I now realize? And I see it a lot now with patients around sexual identity, gender identity, that we have so many more ways of defining ourselves than we did when we were growing up. And what happens when that's no longer congruent with the identity that our families loved and only see? And it's devastating. It's literally devastating. And, I try to support patients and people. So because I'm from the medical model, I say patients and clients. I try to just support clients with, how do you get back to a place of, commonality, but also trying not to apologize for who you are, and trying to just be true to who you are. And you hope the people who say they love you will meet you there. But also I think I apologize too much for people, but in my parents' and family's defense, trying to give them time and space for, I've had my whole life to kind of come to where I'm at in my journey, but it's been a journey, not to throw that word around too much, but it has been. But my parents, this is like new for them. And so when people's identities shift and change, while for me, I've always known that there's been something different about me, for them, they've always been very clear about who Athena is. To ask them to shift that is a big ask. And while they love me and they say they do, for them to find challenge in this does not mean they don't love me. It means that they're having to shift a lot and push against their own racism and push against their own internalized racism and push against so many things. And it's a big ask.
Absolutely. I think, this is so important. I think what you're talking about in relationship to this idea of family in Latinx culture and how that becomes so complicated in terms of enmeshment, how we understand our roles, and then how do we differentiate and understand ourselves outside of our families. And when we find that we are healing, evolving, understanding ourselves in different ways, recognizing that some of the ways that we functioned before were just all ways to adapt to our, family dysfunction and realize that we have to set boundaries for ourselves, right? I think like your husband was saying, we have to close the doors sometimes because we have our own family to deal with. And,
Absolutely.
I think that's such a complex thing. I think that I see it not only in clients, but the people that are around me in my own experience, what that meant for me to differentiate, to set boundaries, to call things out in a way that was really terrifying for me. And I think that it has a different layer of complexity in Latinx families. And I think it becomes very difficult. Like we're talking about, we're both clinicians. We both have the training. We both have the understanding. And it's still hard. And, I think it's important for just to speak to that in terms of how, I imagine for our listeners, I think that even as professional women, even as women who have overcome a lot, who feel very successful in their careers, I think when having to go back to their families of origin and deal with the things that have not been dealt with and all the challenges that come with that, it's very difficult. So I would just love for you to speak to that in terms of, how we, I think your journey is just such a beautiful example of that you just keep working and finding those commonalities and finding the ways that our families can love us. And how do we know that we can set boundaries and still be loving and be loved, that's a possibility.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that piece up, because I do think that it is so complicated to try to explain this to my friends who come from different cultural backgrounds. They'll say like, why do you worry so much about your family and what they think? And I'm like, how do I explain like the grip and the hold that coming from a Latinx family can have on you? And I've met people from other cultures that are very similar, other collective cultures, where other immigrant cultures where it's because of that grip that they survived. Yeah. They survived as a family. They survived as a cultural group. And so it's the very nature of that weave that's so tight that there has been so much resilience and so much survivorship. And so again, I try not to talk about it so much as a good and bad thing, and try not to talk about it with so much dichotomy, but instead sort of like all of the strengths that come from that tight weave, but also within that there come a lot of challenges, especially in a culture like U.S. culture, and more Western informed culture. So I imagine this might happen in a lot of maybe your European cultures, where it hasn't been as necessary, to survive. Yeah. Groups that aren't marginalized and don't have to like look over their shoulder and don't have to pass and don't have to, basically survive by the skin of their teeth. Mm-hmm. But for us and for many like Latin American and immigrant groups, that's what you've needed. And so then to all of a sudden try to differentiate and individuate from that is sometimes terrifying. Yeah. And our families, and I love my family so much for so many reasons, but they have not had the same access to education. Right. Access to just conversations that I've had access to. And so when I hold resentment and anger and sadness towards them, and like, why don't they understand? And why are they ignorant to this experience? Why are they, holding on to, how can they not see that as a racist belief? How can they not understand? I also have to then say, that is a privilege that I have now based on I have a doctorate. My parents barely graduated high school. They actually did attend a couple of years of college that, my grandparents certainly did not. But they didn't finish college. They have worked. They continue to work. They've been working class people their whole lives so that we could go to school.
Yeah. Right.
So I'm super lucky, but they don't have privileges that I have, and I have them because of them. Yeah. So for me to expect that they would have then the ability to, because I don't want to minimize their intelligence. It's not an intelligence thing. They're extremely intelligent, but it's more an access thing. So for me to question their ability to have the same type of conversations that I have, when they haven't had the same kind of access to conversations that I have, feels just unfair.
Yeah.
So I have to push myself, and I have to, but I didn't initially. Initially, I expected them to just miraculously know the things that I know and miraculously jump into conversations that I've just had 20 extra years of. And so they were here this past weekend, and they were incensed that in one of the school boards in El Paso, they wanted to introduce a learning tool that was talking about like gender and sexual equality in the schools. And oh my gosh, they were talking about like, I don't know, like homosexual sex and all this stuff. And in my head, I was like, why do I have a feeling that this is like not even true? Have you even read the book? But I was like, Athena, just let them talk, like listen to them. I was already getting so triggered.
Yeah.
And instead, I just responded with curiosity, because I'm like, these are like staunchly Catholic, 72-year-old Mexicans who literally, this is their world. They don't know a bunch of doctoral level. I don't know who's and what's and where's that I spend all day long debating with and having like wine-filled conversations with, exactly. All these esoteric, like I'm lucky. I love my life. Like, but this is who I know. My world is. And so I just said, Mom, tell me what you're scared of. Tell me what you're afraid of. Talk to me about what this process of, what is the school board process? I'm wondering why they might be introducing this tool. Yeah. Are there kids who are hurting? Have there been incidents that came up? What is the context of them introducing, well, would you want your kids to read this? And I was like, I might, because I would rather my kids learn it from a professional than from at school, from a kid who doesn't know anything, and they're gonna learn it. And so I started just kind of talking, and by the end she was like, pues bueno, pues, but in her defense, by the end she was like, well, I just don't know, honey. The world, I don't understand things the way you do, but it just scares me. Yeah. And that was it. It just scares her.
Right.
And I can understand that.
Yeah.
It's scary for her, and a lot of things scare me, and a lot of things scare a lot of us. And when I can try to connect with people, outside of my parents, when I try to connect, there's been so much division over the last 6 years or so. But when I try to like humanize people and their experiences, it has helped me so much. And especially in this context of my family and trying to feel like and find where I belong again. I keep going back to my mom will break out weeping. I'm 44 years old, and she'll go back to, I was so scared they were going to take you away from me. Yeah. 44 years later, I'm like, Mom, I think this adoption is final. No one's going to come take you away from me. But like this idea of even me and my identity evolving takes her back to fear that she has that I'm still not hers. Same thing, like anytime that anything is different for her, it's like fear. And I kind of zoom out with that and my mom and my family. And this idea, even like with racism, within group racism, it's the same thing. It's like fear, like you're darker than me. like 1, 2, 3, not it, focus on that darker person so that I can survive, right? Like, because I'm scared of not passing, and so I'm going to be more racist against you so that I can survive. And so I think that that's really taught me a lot about, like, we're all just trying to survive, and it's easier and better if I just deflect my fear and point fingers. And to this point of, that's resiliency. It's maladaptive,
right?
But it's also resiliency. And so how do we like kind of approach that with curiosity and patience and kindness versus what I've been approaching it with the last few years, which is like anger and sadness and pain.
Right.
So that was a test for me this past weekend of just trying to be like, this is like coming from a place of fear. And what if I just was curious and patient instead?
Yeah, I love that. Like that idea of just approaching our families, you know, if we're still in connection, if it feels safe enough, with curiosity, you know. And I think that sometimes we have to do that. If we can do that even within ourselves, you know, like how do we even approach ourselves with curiosity about our experience? Like, you know, because I think that as I reflect back on my own childhood, there are moments where it was like, I think I was probably feeling intense anxiety. Like, can I get curious about that experience? And like, what was that like for me? And that was part of my survival, right? That was part of my, you know, some maladaptive behaviors that came out of my experience. But I think the more we can start to approach things with curiosity, right, rather than rigidity, you know, and we're able to move out of fear and anger, we have a different experience, right? Like we get more information that helps with relational connection, helps us understand the depth of, you know, whatever our parents' experiences were that informed the way that they were able to relate and continue to relate to us. So I think that's so valuable. Like,
yeah, it's not easy by any stretch at all. And I don't want to present like it's been easy, but I do agree with you that if we can create space for that gentle, patient, curious approach with ourselves, because of course we're hardest on ourselves. If we're hard on others, you can just tenfold it on ourselves. So to give that kind of grace to ourselves would be incredible.
Yeah. You know, I'm also thinking, you know, as you're talking, and, you know, I've talked about this as well on other podcasts about how white supremacy impacts, you know, our community. And that's a hard conversation to have. That, you know, like you were talking about the sense of, if I know that Blackness is not accepted in our community, then I'm going to differentiate myself, right? Like I'm going to push it out because it feels scary. I don't want to be marginalized. I don't want to feel that way. And I think that we, you know, part of the conversations that are difficult to have is how we, and I think you were speaking to this earlier, like how we have to own our role in that, you know. And I think specifically in, you know, I'll say this has been a whole thing for me. This has been part of my journey. But like, if we, you know, as non-Black Latinas, I think it's so important for us to be able to speak to that and then to own our part in it. And I think that's really difficult because I think it's easy to go to our own experience, like that we're brown. Yep. And so we've had an experience of oppression, you know, and we feel like speaking to our own anti-Blackness is going to negate our own experience when that's totally the opposite. And we just have such difficulty having those conversations in a meaningful way, right? It becomes about, we are unified, right, with trying to support or move forward how we can help free Black people in this country, right?
Absolutely.
But we're not able to own our own part in it.
Yeah, you know, I love how Saira Rao talks about and calls out brown people in this process. And she calls us out hard. I mean, she's calling herself out. You know, she's Asian American and South Asian, and she often gives examples of how until brown people really look at ourselves, look at our own internalized racism, but also look at our own racism, and look at the part we have played, and how that cop-out process of, oh, well, what about us? And I mean, you see this in Mexicans all the time. And what I love about the Chicano movement was that the history of it was one of joining with the original Black social justice movement of the 60s, separate from the current one, where it was like, let's come together and unite, not, well, you've had it worse, no, we've had it worse, and like this sort of oppression Olympics, where now it feels like, and not now, I shouldn't put a timestamp on it, but often in that defensiveness and in that shame that people feel in our own racism, instead of looking at it and unpacking it, we become defensive about it and say, well, I'm Mexican, or I'm Asian, or I'm Indian, or I'm fill in the blank. My people have been oppressed. Yes, that is true. And can you see and identify how, one, this is not the oppression Olympics, two, even if you yourself, and you and I know this because we are in circles and do our own work, but even if we're not personally calling you out, your defensiveness gets in the way of being able to look at this much larger issue of racism against Black people. And how this is such a much larger problem that until we can get on board and help identify and shine a light, you know, we're just taking steps back and staying stuck.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, you know, it's like somehow we believe that our brownness makes us allies
exempt
exempt in some way, but it does not. That it requires more reflection on our part in order to change this, because it's so deeply embedded.
Yeah, and I really appreciate people like who will speak up and say, like, it's the people who say, well, I have a Black friend, or I have adopted a Black child, and it's like, and what? And you know, it's like that means nothing. So having brown skin literally means nothing. Brown people have done exponential harm, and sometimes more harm, to Black and brown people. I mean, that's just a jumping off point that does not exempt you from having to do the work, nor does it exempt you from having to look at your role and in your people's role in racism and continued role in racism against Black people.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's a hard thing.
It is a hard thing. Such an important conversation, though, Athena.
It is.
Feel like, you know, we need to keep the conversation going, because I think it's the thing that is most difficult to talk about. And again, I think going back to our families, it's the thing that sometimes is hardest to call out in our families.
Oh gosh.
And I think that the more that we can do that, the more that we can own that, the more that we can step into that space and know that we're going to support each other to have those difficult conversations, and we have, you know, can continue to cultivate meaningful change.
And I think our role in our families is to model that it's an ever evolving process. It's not something that just, okay, I identify my own racism, and I identify that I've done the work. It's done now. And that's not the case. Like, and why I no longer use the word cultural competency, but instead cultural responsiveness, because that competency implies like a check, I'm done.
Yes.
And instead responsiveness is like, because I'm still always like, ooh, where did that come from? Where did that thought come from? Where did that stereotype come from? Where did that racist belief come from? Like and so I model it to my family because they were like, I'm not racist. I'm not racist. I'm like, yes, you are. We all are.
Exactly.
Just own it so that you can start working on it. And they're like, you don't feel bad calling yourself racist? And I'm like, no, because we are. Once you accept that and look at it, you can start figuring out the why behind it and start fixing it. You know, instead of just hiding and running away. We all have, it's so deeply embedded.
Absolutely. If you grew up in this country,
it's in the soup. Yeah.
It's in you. Yeah. So I know you've touched on this several points of our conversation, what resilience is. So, obviously you know that this podcast is about BIPOC women overcoming trauma and becoming resilient. So I would love to know what resilience means to you.
Yeah. So I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think what resilience means to me, and I've asked this of myself my entire career, just watching people die. Literally, I've been at the bedside as people have died for a lot of years. And I've watched and seen resilience play itself out in different ways. And I've seen it more recently with COVID and within myself. And I think what resilience means to me is that it is also an evolving construct based on where people are in their lives in that moment. And so when a trauma happens, if a trauma were to happen to me today, and the same exact trauma were to happen to me 5 years ago, the resiliency would look different because of the way that I am moving in the world today versus the way I was moving in the world, and who was in my life and what I have borrowed from those people. Resilience to me is how I'm showing up with what energy, what influences I have, what support I have, the cognitive frame of mind, the coping strategies I have, all of that. It's like this perfect formula and also perfect storm of how I am moving through and showing up in the world in that moment. So in 5 years from now, the way resiliency looks in a trauma or just in general will be very different because of, maybe I'll be more of a hot mess then, because who knows, maybe I'll be exhausted, or maybe I'll be ill, God forbid, or maybe who knows. But just depending on my energies and my people and my, cognitive and emotional coping strategies and such, all of that comes together and becomes what resiliency is and how I survive. And so I think that that's what resiliency is. It's just in that moment in time, how all of those things coalesce and kind of help you. It's like your raft and what makes up your raft in that moment. And sometimes your raft has got a gigantic hole in it. Yeah. And you're not as resilient, and sometimes it's like this gigantic cruise ship and you're like, I got this, and so you think about people who have been born into trauma, they don't even have a boat, they have to figure out how to build it as they're going. And so you try to have more patience and grace for those people, realizing like they don't even have the tools, but they've got it. They'll get there. They're more, I don't know, they've just got more grit and street smarts because they'll figure it out. But some people were born with the cruise liner.
Absolutely. I love that. I love that analogy. And that, as you're just thinking about our families, like you're talking about that immigrant experience and like, so many, like our families didn't have a boat, right? And they worked hard.
No, they didn't. Yeah. And they did. And they're beautiful, even with all of their flaws and all of the things that like my family might be doing unwittingly that like cause little dings, I'll take them. I'll take every piece of it, because all of that contributes to the beauty that is me now, that I can identify. Yeah. But it contributes to my resiliency, and I acknowledge that they're all beautiful people. I really do deeply believe in the beauty of people, as long as they're not,
of course,
willingly harming, But I truly do believe that people are good. And I've seen that, especially in the last few years. People they really at their core don't mean to. We're all just trying. We're all just trying our best. Some days I'm just like, whew, I just made it through today. And if we can just try to see people through that lens, I'll take it. I'll take them all with their flaws and everything, and hope that we can just do our best to learn from each other and add it all to our little boats. And
Athena, thank you so much. This was so lovely. I know. You. This feels like, I feel nice we probably have not spoken, I don't know how many years, but it feels like it was just yesterday.
I know. Yesterday.
Absolutely.
And it tells me we should talk more.
Thank you again
I would
so
love
much.
it.
And I'm gonna bring you, I say that to everyone, but I'm gonna bring everyone back because there's so much more to talk. We just
we should have a Marisol
I'm gonna bring
reunion.
Everyone back.
It's like the Housewives reunion.
With actual
but this time with wine or something.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Marisol. This was a pleasure. I really appreciate it.
All right.
Hey, it's Marisol. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Really quick, I wanted to let you know that we have partnered with U.S. Bank on their mission to power human potential through their Community Possible grant program. This program is dedicated to supporting communities like this one while addressing racial and economic inequities. This could be a great opportunity for you, so click the link in this episode description, learn more, and apply.